At the end of the 20th century, the Royal Navy's role is defence. The defence of the United Kingdom, her allies and her interests abroad. To fulfil the varied jobs brought about in this role, the Royal Navy has 131 ships, 45,500 men and women, and 256 aircraft, costing almost £3.7 billion each year. In 1900, the Royal Navy's role is to defend the empire, an empire that stretches across the globe. Across the Atlantic is Canada. On the other side of the world is Australia and New Zealand. And in between there are numerous territories in Africa and the Far East. To defend these countries, Britain has the largest and most powerful navy in the world. The steelworks of Britain are turning out ships faster than ever before, and by 1900, the Royal Navy has 36 battleships, more than all her potential enemies put together. On the horizon is a new class of battleship, one that will make all others obsolete. The Dreadnought and its 6 sister ships were launched between 1906 and 1910. Costing more than £1.8 million each, they have a revolutionary steam turbine. This means they are lighter than the conventional battleships, which allows more than twice the armament. For the first time, 10 massive 12-inch guns can be fired in one broadside. Over the next few years, the guns get even bigger. The Queen Elizabeth class has 8 15-inch guns. This means that they can fire shells weighing almost 2,000 pounds over 13 miles. They are also faster, at 25 knots, a speed brought about by switching from coal to oil-fired boilers. In 1914, Britain goes to war against Germany. The first British victory of the Sea War is fought in the South Atlantic. On the 8th of December 1914, Vice Admiral Sir Doveton Sturdee uses the superior speed and armament of his battle cruisers to destroy a German force commanded by Admiral von Speer. The Battle of the Falkland Islands revenges the defeat a month earlier of a British force off the Chilean coast at Coronel. On the fleet's return to port, King George V congratulates Sturdee and his men. His presence on board ship shows the importance of the victory and the lessons learned from it. Sturdee had concentrated his force to take advantage of his superior firepower. There are now no German forces of any significance left at sea to attack merchant shipping. Unfortunately, the lessons are not put into practice during the largest fleet action of the war. By 1916, the British Grand Fleet is trained to perfection, but without an enemy in sight. However, the German Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Scheer, decides on a plan to lure the Grand Fleet from its base in Scapa Flow. Using an attack on merchant shipping as a decoy, he hopes to find the fleet without destroyer protection and decimate it near the German coast. Britain has already found the ability to intercept and decode German naval messages, and so the Grand Fleet sails on the 30th of May 1916. First, the two battlecruiser fleets engage. The British, under the command of Admiral Sir David Beatty, find themselves outgunned and lose 2 ships. Beatty, however, continues to pursue until the German high seas fleet is sighted. He then turns and lures the enemy into the waiting guns of British battleships under the command of Admiral Jellicoe. Jellicoe deploys his ships brilliantly, and the German fleet finds itself at a tactical and numerical disadvantage. The German fleet reverses course and achieves a temporary escape. However, Scheer only blunders into the devastating fire of the Grand Fleet again. As night falls, the German fleet batters its way through the screen of light British forces between them and their home bases and slips home. There is no doubt that otherwise there would have been an overwhelming defeat for the High Seas Fleet the next day. 250 ships fight the only major surface action of the war. The British lose more ships, 14 compared to the Germans' 11, but strategically it is a British victory. Jellicoe believes that he cannot win the war by defeating the German fleet, but that he can lose the war if he did not preserve his own. His cautious manner leads to his replacement the following year by Admiral Beatty. Beatty, however, continues with the cautious policy. The Grand Fleet continues to blockade Germany for the rest of the war. Meanwhile, Scheer's failure at Jutland leads him to pursue the other half of his offensive policy, war under the sea. Using both guns and torpedoes, U-boats sink more than 11 million tons of Allied shipping. In the winter of 1916-17, Britain is close to defeat at sea. However, the instigation of the convoy system in April 1917 is very successful. Essential supplies begin to flow again. U-boat losses soar, and with the introduction of new anti-submarine technology, Britain's supply route is secure. The straits between Dover and the French coast are vital to Britain. Across these few miles go all the supplies for the British Army. Despite German forces holding the Belgian coast for most of the 4 years of the First World War, their navy singularly fails to interrupt the flow. On occasions they do try, taking on the destroyers of the Dover Patrol. In one of these attacks, the German destroyers are soundly beaten by the crews of HMS Swift and HMS Broke. It is one of the few naval actions of the 20th century in which ramming and hand-to-hand fighting take place. As well as protecting the supply route, the Royal Navy also takes the fight to the enemy on the Belgian coast. They build up a force of bombardment ships, specially designed for this task. They are called monitors. The monitors fight out their own private war against German shore batteries. With the German fleet effectively neutralized and the U-boat menace countered by the use of convoy, the Royal Navy then plays its part in reducing supplies to Germany. This virtual blockade of German ports helps to hasten the end of the war. The First World War at sea ends in stalemate. Jutland proves to be the final action in history where two magnificent fleets of battleships meet on the high seas. Dreadnought and its sister ships had been a new breed, but a breed that was to last for just a few short years, for the day of the battleship is effectively at an end. In 1921, off the east coast of the United States, one event finally seals the long-term fate of the battleship. General Billy Mitchell, an exponent of air power, bombs and sinks a captured German ship, the Ostfriesland. The supremacy of the battleship is over. It is still a time away, but the new capital ship for the world's navies is the aircraft carrier. Tried and tested during the First War, the aircraft carrier gained strength during the 1920s and 30s. Initially, they are little more than colliers or ferries converted to seaplane carriers. They cannot even launch an aircraft, merely winching one over the side, where it taxis and flies away. However, the theory develops, and the flat top, complete with its own runway, soon appears. The Navy had been the first of the British armed services to embrace the aircraft before the war. Now it is taking the lead in this new way of warfare. For most of the 20 years between the wars, the Royal Navy has little control over its own aviation. The struggle between the Navy and the newly formed Royal Air Force is bitter, with Sir David, now Earl Beatty, arguing with the RAF. They seem to be getting somewhere in 1924, when the Fleet Air Arm of the RAF is formed. It is agreed that so-called fleet flights, normally controlled by the RAF, will be given over to the Navy when they're flown from aircraft carriers. The struggle finally ends in 1937, with the Fleet Air Arm returning to the control of the Navy. The aircraft carrier creates a new kind of warfare. Aircraft can now be carried as part of the fleet. They can be used for fleet protection, and so purpose-built naval fighters are built. They can also be used as part of a strike force against both sea and land targets, and so carrier-borne bombers are ordered. Naval aviation brings forward specialist naval aircraft manufacturers. Among them is Blackburn Aircraft, based in Brough, near Hull. They build a number of torpedo bombers, starting with the Dart in 1923. Its top speed is only 107 miles per hour, but its landing speed of just 38 miles per hour makes it a natural choice for aircraft carrier use. The Dart is followed by the Ripon, which sets the standard for British torpedo bombers until the arrival of the first of the monoplanes in 1939, the Bristol Beaufort. By 1939, the carrier is an essential part of the Royal Navy. Warfare is changing from ship versus ship conflict to aircraft versus ship, with devastating effect. Germany never embraces the carrier concept. 2 carriers are planned, but never materialize. So, as Hitler brings his war plans to fruition in the late 1930s, naval aviation is not a priority. He is, however, a confirmed believer in sea power. The Anglo-German Naval Treaty of 1935 allows Germany to build a fleet up to 35% of the size of the Royal Navy. This is based on Earl Beatty's belief that Germany is one country in the world we have nothing to fear in the way of an arms race. In the next few years, the sight of German battleships and battle cruisers on the high seas will show how misguided these comments are. The Royal Navy herself had seen severe cutbacks after the First World War. But in 1936, as Hitler widens his sphere of influence in Europe, more orders are placed for warships of every size. At the outbreak of war, the Royal Navy is once again the largest navy in the world. There are 12 battleships, with 9 more under construction, 3 battle cruisers and numerous cruisers, destroyers, and specialist ships. But the reconstruction program to bring new types into service is only just beginning. It remains to be seen whether they can meet the threat of a rearming German Kriegsmarine. The Schleswig-Holstein had been built in 1906 at the Germania yards as one of 5 Deutschland-class ships of the line. She fought at Jutland in 1916 before becoming flagship to the German fleet in the 1920s. But on the 1st of September 1939, she fires the first shots in Hitler's campaign to invade Poland. By bombarding Danzig, she ignites a flame that will burn for almost 6 years. Germany's conquest of Poland is swift. The Polish Air Force is destroyed on the ground in 2 days, as modern bombers wreak havoc on Polish airfields. A week later, the German Blitzkrieg reaches the outskirts of the Polish capital. Although Warsaw itself holds out until the 27th of September, effectively the campaign is over. A nation of 33 million people is crushed almost before the war has started. The first attacks on German shipping in their northern German ports are carried out by Bomber Command. However, the wrong fuses mean that even when bombs do hit, they normally bounce off before exploding. It is to be left to the Navy to score the first big hit. The German pocket battleship, the Graf Spee, is cornered in Montevideo Harbor in neutral Uruguay. It has been the most successful of the surface raiders sent out from German ports soon after the outbreak of war, sinking 9 ships in barely 2 months in the Indian Ocean. British ships are sent to hunt her down, but Graf Spee has slipped back into the Atlantic. 3 cruisers under the command of Commodore Henry Howard assemble off the mouth of the River Plate, assuming that Graf Spee will aim for ships plying the trading routes south of Brazil. On the 12th of December, they bring Graf Spee to battle. Heavily outgunned, the British cruisers nevertheless inflict damage on the German ship, which turns away and drops anchor in Montevideo Harbor. Knowing that Graf Spee still constitutes a major threat, the British ply the radio stations with misinformation about the strength of non-existent British forces in the area. This pressures Graf Spee's captain, Hans Langsdorff, into cabling Berlin for advice. The alternatives are to fight their way out to Argentina, where the government is sympathetic, or face internment. Hitler's reply recommends neither. And so on the 18th of December, in front of watching crowds and the world's press, Graf Spee slips out of harbour and transfers her crew to a waiting German steamer. Within minutes, the night sky is lit up by flames as their magazines are blown up with thunderous explosions. 2 days after the scuttling of his ship, Captain Langsdorff commits suicide. Since the capitulation of Poland, Europe has enjoyed an uneasy peace. But in April 1940, the focus switches to Norway. Germany has been receiving supplies of Swedish iron ore through Norwegian ports to avoid the British blockade of Germany. To counter this, the Royal Navy begins mining their coastal waters. To protect his supply lines, Hitler orders the occupation of Norway. By the 9th of April, German forces have landed and are occupying the capital, Oslo, and the main ports of Trondheim, Narvik, and Bergen. And this is despite the presence of the Royal Navy's home fleet, consisting of 30 ships which fight a number of small engagements but never bring the main German force to battle. At sea, the British fight back well in 2 operations at Narvik. On the 10th of April, the destroyer flotilla enters the fjord and sinks 3 German destroyers and a number of merchant ships. 3 days later, the battleship Warspite and 9 destroyers go back to deal with the remaining German ships. The last 8 German destroyers and a single U-boat are sunk, leaving the Royal Navy in command of the fjord and the northern waters off Norway. With German forces neutralized, the belated British landings take place. However, a few brigades of mainly territorials with no effective air cover are all that is available to take on 7 German divisions. 2 of the landings, at Namsos and Andalsnes, are evacuated within 3 weeks. Only at Narvik does a mixed force of British, French and Polish troops succeed, taking the town on the 28th of May. But even this success is marred by events to the south. The struggle for Norway is abandoned, and the last Allied troops are evacuated between the 4th and 9th of June. The Norwegian campaign teaches the British forces many lessons. Combined operations where the Navy and Army work together need special training. But above all is the need for specialized landing craft. These lessons are well learned for the many amphibious landings that will take place later in the war. The events to the south are the long-awaited German offensive. On the 10th of May, the Blitzkrieg is launched against Holland, Belgium and France. Belief in the Maginot Line on their northern border had led the French to think they were impregnable. The elaborate defences had cost 160,000 million pounds, but incredibly, it only covered part of the border. On the 26th of May, the order goes out to the Navy, begin Operation Dynamite, the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk. Considered by some as a miracle, the evacuation is, in fact, a carefully planned operation. It calls upon the ingenuity of not just the Royal and Merchant Navies, but also the owners of hundreds of small craft, many of which are only suitable for river cruising. Within 24 hours, 7,000 men are lifted from Dunkirk, a further 40,000 by the 29th of May. By the end of the operation on the 4th of June, a staggering 338,000 men are rescued, three-quarters of the BEF, together with many French troops. But virtually all of their equipment is left behind. The whole operation is carried out under intense air attack. Stukas wheel and dive overhead, and men who still have rifles take potshots at them. 9 destroyers are sunk, together with many of the small craft. But constant patrols over the beaches and ships by Spitfires and Hurricanes of the RAF mean that losses are kept to a minimum. 132 German aircraft are shot down. The Navy had turned a tactical defeat into a strategic victory. The equipment will be replaced and civilian morale is intact. When the last British troops have left France, Hitler concentrates the efforts of his forces on subduing the French army. On the 10th of June, German forces cross the River Seine. This act alone removes the French will to resist. Fearful of what might happen to their capital, the French government leaves Paris, declaring it an open city. Just 2 days later, German troops march down the Champs-Élysées. The French capital now belongs to Germany. France's President Paul Reynaud resigns, and his successor, Marshal Pétain, wastes no time in asking Hitler for an armistice. In a show intended to humiliate the French, the surrender is accepted at a meeting at Rétende in the forest of Compiègne on the 22nd of June. The scene is a railway carriage, the same one that saw the surrender of the German forces to Marshal Foch at the end of the First World War. With the collapse of France, Germany now controls the Channel coastline and all its ports. The Luftwaffe is also able to move forward to landing fields from which it can launch an attack against Britain. The opening phase of the ensuing battle is attacks against convoys in the English Channel, designed to clear the sea lanes for Hitler's proposed invasion. By August the 11th, 1940, British ships have stopped using the Channel in daylight, and the Royal Navy has withdrawn from Dover to Portsmouth. Round 1 to Germany. But the Luftwaffe has not succeeded in wearing down RAF fighter command. the Battle of Britain is a decisive British victory. The invasion is postponed and Britain is safe from German attack. While the Battle of Britain is in progress, Italy declares war, claiming the Mediterranean for herself. The Royal Navy is hard-pressed to find ships to cover this vast tract of sea, and the bulk of responsibility lies with the Mediterranean fleet based at Gibraltar. It is commanded by one of the most brilliant minds in the Royal Navy, Vice Admiral Andrew Cunningham. Possibly Cunningham's greatest feat of arms is the night attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto Harbour on the 11th of November 1940. In the world's first ever carrier strike against a fleet in a defended base, Cunningham's aircraft destroy or severely damage elements of the Italian fleet. This action goes a long way to restore the balance of sea power in the Mediterranean. Chief destroyer is the Fairey Swordfish. The Swordfish had entered service with the Fleet Air Arm in 1936. At the start of the war, it was already obsolete, but it was the only torpedo bomber available to equip every aircraft carrier in the Royal Navy. The Swordfish has a top speed of only 139 miles per hour, and at low level during attacks, even this speed cannot be achieved. To an extent, this is to her benefit. Flying low and slow, many ships find that their armament is unable to depress far enough and the bullets fly harmlessly over the aircraft. However, when faced by enemy fighters, it is a different story. The Swordfish's illustrious career continues to the end of the war, by which time almost 2,400 have been built. Egypt holds the key to the Suez Canal and the Middle Eastern oil fields. But Egypt is at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. This means that the lifeline between the British port at Gibraltar, the besieged island of Malta, and Alexandria in Egypt is the longest in history. Convoys supplying the British forces in Egypt have to run the gauntlet of both U-boats and land-based enemy aircraft. Therefore, they have to be well protected by Royal Navy ships. One such convoy is codenamed Pedestal. Between the 10th and the 15th of August 1942, 14 cargo transports are escorted by 32 Royal Navy ships to Malta. Incessant attacks sink 9 of the merchantmen, as well as a carrier and 2 cruisers. Just 5 of the original merchant convoy reach Malta. Among them is the tanker Ohio, full of fuel to keep the island's fighters flying. Malta could fight on. The only way that supplies can be stopped from reaching the Axis forces in North Africa is by the British submarines based at Malta. Britain's own U-boats are 6 submarines called Urge, Unbeaten, Unique, Ursula, Upright and Upholder. They inflict heavy losses on German and Italian convoys. By October 1942, the Mediterranean is secure. Resupplied, Montgomery's 8th Army attacks at El Alamein and pushes Rommel's Afrika Korps out of Egypt. Harried all the way down the long coast road, the Axis forces finally abandon North Africa in May 1943. On the morning of the 24th of May 1941, the British wake to hear terrible news. The pride of the Royal Navy and the largest ship in the British fleet, HMS Hood, has been sunk by a broadside from Bismarck. The battleship Prince of Wales is also badly damaged. The Bismarck is a huge battleship that had been commissioned as recently as 1940. With its 8 15-inch guns, a multitude of smaller armament and a top speed of 30 knots, it is considered by the Germans to be virtually unsinkable. It is also considered enemy number 1 by the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, and Admiral Sir John Tovey, Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet. After the sinking of the Hood, Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen survive an attack from Swordfish off HMS Victorious and shake off the British ship shadowing them. For 2 days, RAF reconnaissance aircraft from RAF Coastal Command try to find her. Which route will the Bismarck take? The sea battle had taken place in the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland. This gives a vast array of possible routes for Bismarck to enter the North Atlantic and attack merchant shipping. British cruisers use their radar to try to find her, but to no avail. Finally, a message from Admiral Lutyens on board Bismarck is intercepted. The Catalina of Coastal Command, knowing where to search, spots Bismarck through a break in the clouds and signals its bearings back to the British fleet. The Admiralty had been so concerned at the thought of Bismarck free to attack merchant shipping that they had ordered Force H to leave its base at Gibraltar and enter the South Atlantic. With Bismarck steaming towards the Bay of Biscay, the Swordfish of HMS Ark Royal find themselves in range for an airstrike. On the afternoon of May the 26th, Swordfish are launched from the pitching deck of the carrier. Expecting just one ship in the area, they attack, believing their target is Bismarck. Luckily, no torpedoes hit, as they are actually attacking the British cruiser Sheffield. Rapidly, another strike is launched. Courageously flying through a fierce hail of gunfire, the Swordfish drop their torpedoes, this time on the correct target. 2 hits are registered, including one on the stern, which completely wrecks her steering gear. Bismarck is helpless as the British fleet homes in. The flagship, King George V, batters Bismarck with fire from her 16-inch guns. So many shells are fired that the deck plates on King George V buckle with the heat and the recoil of the guns. Finally, Bismarck is nothing but a blazing hulk. The coup de grace is delivered by the destroyer Dorsetshire, which sinks Bismarck with 3 torpedoes. The sinking of the Bismarck is a great victory for the Royal Navy. Ships that had taken part in the action are proud to add the name of Bismarck to their roll of honor. However, it is not forgotten that Bismarck was only one of the many powerful surface raiders available to the German Navy. 2 of the finest are Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Both ships had been out into the Atlantic earlier in the war, but in 1942 they're holed up in Brest on the French coast. Despite the presence of the Luftwaffe, it proves impossible to protect the port against ever stronger RAF attacks. It is decided to bring the ships home to Germany. Normally, the only safe passage would be via the long route. This would take the ships well west, out into the Atlantic, round Britain and Ireland, and back to Germany. This time, they follow Hitler's personal advice. The best thing to do, he said, is to steam up the channel completely unexpected. At 11 o'clock on the evening of the 11th of February 1942, with an air raid in progress and smoke shrouding the port, the great ships slip quietly out of Brest. In the lead is Scharnhorst, with Vice Admiral Otto Ciliax, commander of the group, on board. It is followed by Gneisenau and finally Prinz Eugen, the heavy cruiser that had survived the Bismarck operation. Throughout the morning they steam without trouble. By good planning they have caught the British completely by surprise. By good luck, the British radar reconnaissance network has broken down. It is not until midday that the fleet is spotted by 2 Spitfires on patrol. Even then, it's a further 90 minutes before any attack begins. First, it is the shore guns at Dover, firing at the limit of their range and scoring no success. Then it is 6 Fairey Swordfish, attacking with torpedoes. All 6 of these ancient aircraft are shot down by the heavy fire put up by the German ships. Even when Scharnhorst hits a mine, it barely interrupts her passage for more than 30 minutes. Soon the ships will be at their home port of Wilhelmshaven. There they will join the German home fleet and become a new menace to the convoys rounding the North Cape. As Grand Admiral Raeder inspects the ship and its crew, he is not to know that the day of the German surface raider is virtually at an end. At the Battle of North Cape on Boxing Day 1943, Scharnhorst is sunk by the big guns of HMS Duke of York and a flotilla of destroyers and cruisers. This leaves one mighty battleship to deal with, the enormous sister ship of Bismarck, the Tirpitz. Disabled on a number of occasions by midget submarines and carrier-based aircraft, it is left to the heavy bombers to finish her off completely.
4 a.m., Sunday, 12th November. RAF Lancasters take off on a 1,200-mile flight to Norway. 29 of the four-motored craft head for Tromsøy Fjord, where the Tirpitz, last of Germany's big battleships, had eluded two recent attacks. The first, on 15th September, was unsuccessful owing to an amazing smoke screen created by thousands of smoke pots. These pictures, taken from a reconnaissance plane at 13,000 feet, show how effectively the Tirpitz was concealed. No hits were scored by the RAF on this run. In these British films, the Tirpitz is seen firing her 15-inch guns as the second attack was attempted on 29th October. Again the smoke screen, this time combined with bad weather, made bullseye bombing a hazardous venture. However, the RAF managed to score one hit with a 12,000-pounder. As long as the Tirpitz remained afloat, she was a potential threat to the Russian convoy route, tying up strong forces of British war